Right, today I've come to Witney in Oxfordshire, to a village of Minster Lovell, to see Minster Lovell Manor and Dovecot. And it's a 15th century manor built in the 1430s, I believe, by a Mr. William Lovell. I say Mr., he's actually Baron of Lovell Holland, I think. Anyway, a baron. It doesn't particularly matter, and is a magnificent example of medieval manorial architecture. It is unfortunately in ruins, but in some ways that's kind of interesting too, seeing how things were destroyed. And it was relatively intact until about 1730, when it was repurposed into farm buildings, and that process knocked the roof in. So it couldn't really be used as anything after that. So yeah, let's go and have a look around it. So these are the ruins, and they're really quite magnificent. About a quarter, maybe even only a fifth, of the building survives, which goes to show how large medieval manors could be. Manor was the seat of power for a lord, and this one was one of the best in the country. The owner was one of the richest men in the country. He had returned from the wars in France, part of the 100 Years' War. A very successful, very wealthy man. This must have been huge. William was a loyal supporter of the king. So was his son John. He supported Henry VI. But the War of the Roses took their toll. The grandson Francis served Richard III. And if you remember your history, Richard III came out rather badly in the War of the Roses. And at the Battle of Bosworth Field, Henry Tudor became king, Henry VII, and the property was seized by the crown. It passed through a few families, but none of them wanted this as their main residence. Despite the fact that it was huge and lovely, they all had other residences, so it was used mostly by servants to administer the local lands that came with the manor. I don't know if I'll be able to get this in to show up on camera. There's a spiral staircase there that now goes absolutely nowhere. And I always find spiral staircases give me anxiety anyway, because they're so steep and usually very uneven. But the thought of coming down that is pretty terrifying. So this particular part of the building would have been the private apartments of the lord of the manor. The entire manor was a working building, so only part of it would be used for luxury, and this was that part. So the bottom floor where I'm standing now, up to that level there, that would have been for servants and staff. But above that, from here up, that would have all been the private residence of the lord of the manor. And he would have had windows running all along here, joining up over there. And it would have been a very large space for any medieval baron. You can see here more buildings that have been demolished, have fallen in. The well was a 16th century addition by the staff. They used to get water from the river there in the medieval period. And this central area is a courtyard that all the buildings would have gone around. You can see more of it over there. And that was the plan for most manor houses, buildings around a courtyard. Following on from the Roman tradition, and would reach its height in the Tudor period, really. Post-Tudor, things became much more stately, less workmen, and they could come up with really, really interesting designs. Right, so back into the Great Hall again, looking around it, and if you were a guest of William, John or Francis, you would be taken either through this door here, which leads into the chapel. This would have been the private chapel of the manor. It was fairly unusual in that it was 2 stories high. Most private chapels were quite small, and it's a demonstration of the wealth of the man, William Lovell, who built it. Or if you weren't wanting to pray and give thanks that you successfully made it to visit your friend, you would be taken through here and led up either into this area, which is the solar, and if any of you have read Game of Thrones, the Ice and Fire series, they always go to the solar, and this would have been a room full of windows to let in as much light as possible, usually quite warm, although obviously sometimes quite cold. All those windows did let the heat out, and that would be where you would be entertained by the family, this big room here. And if you were very good friends, they might lead you not on the ground floor, but on the upper floor into the private apartments, which, if you remember, are here, which is quite nice. But what if you were not a friend of the family? What if you were a tradesman or a working class person? Now, if you were a tradesman or a farmer in the parish, you would almost never go there or there. That was a very rare luxury for anyone who wasn't a personal friend. You would be sent this way. That door led to the outside world, and we'll come through this one as well. And you would have been taken through to what would have been the buttery, bakehouse, and kitchens. Now, a buttery didn't necessarily mean butter, although it could. It could also mean where the beer and wine was stored, as in butts of wine, butts of beer. And your job would be to look after this area. You would not venture over to that side unless you had a specific task to do, such as laying the fires or cleaning, or you might, if you were a farmer, be invited to talk with the master of the manor. But in general, no, you would never go over that side as a poor farmer, working man, or servant. I was actually wrong when I identified that as a dovecot, just because it kind of looks like one and is full of doves. Yeah, the family would have laughed at me for saying that, because their dovecot is over there. It's that building, that oval building, that is absolutely huge and has enough space for thousands and thousands of doves. I'm used to the more quaint Victorian pigeon fancier kind of dovecot, so whoops from me. Man, you really get a sense of scale with things like that. Just seeing the void spaces. There would have been a grand staircase there. He's not going to show up very well on camera, but there's a heron just on the other side of the river. I don't get to see a heron very often. They're not stunningly rare, but they're rare enough. And that shows how good the river must be, for there still to be fish and frogs and things for the heron to eat. He seems pretty okay with me being here, but I'm still going to leave him alone. So this is the remainder of one of the fish ponds that the house used to keep. They were well supplied with fish, even into the 1600s, when people didn't tend to live here anymore. They always said that the fish ponds were, and I quote, replete with pike, trout, crayfish, chub, and lots of other English river fish. So always well supplied with that. Also eels, lampreys, things of that type. Very well supplied, and now it's just got ducks on it. This is the remainder of the other fish pond. This one has become rather more stagnant and fetid. The great advantage of these fish ponds is that being right next to the river, they could easily be fed with fresh water, but at the same time, you don't have to constantly be patrolling who's fishing on your river or worrying about your fish escaping. They are trapped. They cannot leave. And anyone fishing in your fish pond is someone you can easily catch and get hold of because they're on your land. And yeah, poaching was a capital crime. It would usually end in a hanging unless the Lord of the Manor was a very lenient individual. Even poaching fish was a hanging offence in most cases. So this tower here is a slightly later addition. It was added by John, the son, and had would have had a very handsome apartment on the top floor up there. This, thank you, Hand, that is the remainder of a full-height window that would have lit that room beautifully, and would have been an excellent place for private study, as it would have remained quite light for most of the day. And all this side would have been private apartments leading to the Lord's apartment there, their solar, the Great Hall, and then on this side there would have been the more workman side. There would have been the buttery, the kitchens, stables, all of that sort of thing. Richard III visited here about 2 years before he was killed at Bosworth, and its proximity to Woodcote, just north of Oxford, is only 10 miles, which makes it very convenient. Woodcote used to be the site of a royal palace, somewhat near Blenheim Palace. Yeah, quite a nice place. Would have been lovely if it had survived, but it does have its own romantic Victorian feeling. The Victorians loved ruins like this. So this is the tomb of William Lovell, the man who built the manor. It's quite a magnificent piece of 15th century stone crafting. You can see a full plate Gothic armour, as was typical at the time. And he has a dirk blade. That's actually the killing weapon of a soldier at this time, because after you've beaten them to submission with your long sword, you've still got to get through their armour. And just because the other person is exhausted or injured, they might not actually have any chinks in their armour that you can get through very easily. So this dirk would have been made of a very rigid piece of metal, very sharp point, and it would be driven through any gaps they could find. Or it is also strong enough that it can be driven straight through the breastplate or another piece of armour. That does take remarkable strength. Better to aim for the face or the gap between breastplate and helmet, or under the arms, places like that. But if we go around, this longsword he would find that very difficult to kill anyone in armour with. He might be able to if he got the point in somewhere soft, but this armour was fully enclosing, and to actually get the sword point in, very unlikely the sword would bend, or it wouldn't be sharp enough. Just by its own nature, that's not what the sword was for. But a dirk like this would be made much harder, much sharper, something that you can actually drive through the armour with a firm hammer-like blow. And with armour and weapons like that, it's no wonder that he did well in France.